County, and I have portions of Douglas County, Franklin County, Miami County, and Johnson County. And this is my first time on this committee, and this is now my second term. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Barth. So just going to start with requests for committee-sponsored bill drafts. Are there any requests for committee-sponsored bill drafts? Secretary Howard.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. I have 3 bill drafts to request for introduction. The first is RS 78. And that is a bill concerning minors related to the Kansas Code for the Care of Children that will reduce the number of days a custodian can place, that the court can place a child in secure care.
Okay, are there any questions on this bill draft? Any questions? Any objections? Okay, your next one.
Thank you. The next one is RS 79. This bill would increase the frequency of child in need of care permanency hearings from every 12 months to every 9 months.
Okay, committee, are there any questions on that one? Any objections? Okay, thank you. Your third one?
The last one is RS 80, which would change the definition of neglect in the Child in Need of Care Code and redefine neglect, including a prohibition on removal due solely to the lack of financial resources.
Okay, is there any questions on that one? Any objections? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Secretary Howard. Okay, committee, so today is what I'm kind of calling the state of child welfare. We are going to do some history lessons and some just current facts from DCF on where we are today, mostly for the new people in the committee, just to kind of give you a general overview of what child welfare looks like in Kansas. So first, I'd like to recognize, actually, first we're going to do Cora Coma, aren't we? Yeah. Okay, so before we get into that, Jesse Pringle, our Office of Revisor of Statutes, is going to go over Cora and Coma with us.
All right, good afternoon, committee. I won't take much time since we have a full agenda, but I'm just going to spend the next few minutes doing kind of your weekly or daily reminder of Kansas Open Meetings Act and Kansas Open Records Act. So for the Kansas Open Meetings Act, it's a law that provides that meetings of public bodies be open to the public. This includes subcommittees or working groups if you are on a joint committee or any interim committee this upcoming interim or summer. So it defines a meeting as any gathering of the body's members that includes a majority of the body's members, and that is held for the purpose of discussing the business of the body. So all 3 of those things require a reasonable notice that a meeting is being held. And so the meeting can come in all sorts of different forms, formal, informal, and here at a lunch, in a group text, in a reply all of an email, etc., any interactive, communicative way. It requires that the majority of membership is here, so more than half of the members that are currently in this room would lend to a violation of the Kansas Open Meetings Act. And complying with the act is important because there are some penalties that may be addressed if there is a violation. So that includes a fee of $500 for persons violating the law, and then they're also required to complete a training related to that act. So that's the Kansas Open Meetings Act, and if there's any questions, feel free to talk to me afterwards, or I'm available here. But there's also the Kansas Open Records Act, and so that relates to the documents. So that requires that records of a public body, such as this committee, be open for inspection to the public. And so that's any recorded information being provided. So for example, the handouts that are in the S drive today, any testimony, bill briefs, etc., those all become open records under the Open Records Act and is available for the public to inspect and view. So there are some exceptions for what is an open record. This is determined generally by a case-for-case basis, but you know, if we're talking about very personally identifiable information related to a child, that's even an exclusion from the Open Meetings Act. So information like that is not an open records. Any work product done by a legislator, or when you request a bill draft from me, that's considered a legislative document that's not up for the Open Records Act or public inspection. So remember that when you receive documents in committee, that those are open records. And remember, if there's a group of more than half of you, that's an open meeting that requires notice to the public.
Thank you, Jesse. And just for clarification, if they were to receive any open records request, how should they proceed?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. So Madam Chair Howerton is the custodian of the committee's records. And so if there's an open information request that goes to her, she immediately notifies us in our office. Upon that date of that request, we have 3 days to fulfill that. So the 3-day timeline, if you've heard of that, relates to once that record is requested, not necessarily once that record is created.
Yeah, Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I know as a detective, my investigative notes were protected. Now, if I do notes, et cetera, as I'm checking on things, those should still be protected, wouldn't they? As long as I don't submit them or use them within any of the open meeting?
Correct. Yes. So I would consider that your personal confidential legislative work product. Now, if you took copies, distributed it to every single member, then that becomes a public record.
Thank you.
Representative Neighbor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. When you said a reasonable amount of time to let people know about the meeting, what is considered reasonable?
Yeah, so there's no explicit definition that I can, unfortunately give you right now. Reasonable is mainly under the circumstances. So it could be given at the well the day before. If a bill is, emergency, we're on the floor, we need to be done. Notice can be given that day. It's just reasonable in the way that it is given to the public. So, through the committee assistant Judy, online, even at the well. The way it's given and the time is all dependent on the circumstances, and that's taken into account.
Turn my mic off. So if people are going to be there to testify or are going to be required to testify, it would be not reasonable to announce it in the morning. It was happening in the afternoon because people might be traveling.
So it's possible.
Over the web.
So I would say under the circumstances, if there was any notice given that a potential hearing might occur, then the notice of the official one that morning could likely suffice, given the circumstances that there was some sort of notice, not albeit official notice provided, that could be determined reasonable.
Thank you.
Any other questions, committee? Okay, thank you, Jesse. Okay, so now Natalie with the research department, Natalie Nelson, is going to give us kind of a brief history you have, and she'll talk about this, the timeline in front of you.
All right. Good afternoon, committee, Madam Chair. So yes, I am Natalie Nelson from the Legislative Research Department. And the very large paper you have before you is what our office put together as sort of some of the more significant, I guess, events, reforms in child welfare over the last almost 100 years now. So starting in, I'll just get started. Starting in 1937, the Kansas Welfare Act was established, and it established the State Board of Social Welfare, and that maximized the ability of the state to utilize federal funding under the Federal Social Security Act. 1949, that the State Department of Social Welfare was established. That is sort of just the first precursor of our child and family agency here in Kansas. Under that model, the counties were retained primary administrative control over child welfare. And from 1973 to 1977, the Department of Social and Rehabilitation Services was established, or SRS, as you may remember it. SRS replaces the State Board and Department of Social Welfare, and that was done by executive reorganization order, which we'll see again here shortly. And so at that point, social welfare programs all social welfare programs were administered by the state at that point and no longer administered by the county. And then we jump ahead to 1982, and that is when the Kansas Code for Care of Children, the SINC code as we know it, was enacted. And that law defines the authority and responsibilities of the courts, law enforcement officers, and SRS in cases where child abuse or neglect is suspected, specifies that preventive and rehabilitative services must be provided for children in their own homes whenever possible, replaces the Kansas Juvenile Code, and reflects federal mandates of the Adoption Assistance and Child Welfare Act of 1980. So then we jump ahead again to 1989. In that year, a class action lawsuit, which was called Sheila A. versus Finney, was filed against the state alleging that SRS failed to adequately care for children who may have been victims of an abuse or neglect. And then performance audits conducted by Legislative Division of Post Audit in 1990 and 1991 also identified serious weaknesses in the state's foster care system, which we'll see how that resolves here in the box after the next. But in 1992, funding approved by the legislature expands family preservation services statewide. So I think they were sort of piecemeal in certain counties at that time, but the funding, allowed more of those services to be provided. So in 1993, the settlement in that class action lawsuit was approved, which included 153 requirements with which SRS was required to comply with within certain timeframes. And then 1996 and through 1997, that's probably one of the more significant shifts here in Kansas, in which we became the first state in the United States to fully privatize the foster care system, and that's implemented in 3 phases. So I think first it was adoption services was first privatized in October of 1996, then followed by foster care case management in February 1997, and then family preservation services, I think July of that year. And then 2006, the SINC code was substantially revised. So that's why it's now called the Revised Kansas Code for Care of Children. And that just clarified and simplified language to resolve ambiguities in the prior law. 2012, we had an executive reorganization order issued by Governor Brownback. It renamed SRS the Department for Children and Families, and within that ERO, several functions and programs were transferred to the Kansas Department for Aging and Disability Services. Then in 2015, ERO number 43 transferred foster care licensing responsibilities from KDHE to DCF. Then 2015 to 2016 is when we started seeing some legislative oversight of the child welfare system. So the Legislative Coordinating Council authorized a special committee on foster care adequacy, and those met in the 2015 and 2016 legislative interim. And 2017, then the legislature authorized the Secretary for Children and Families to establish a child welfare system task force through legislation. And then 2018 is where we get into the McIntyre versus Howard class action lawsuit filed in federal court on behalf of a class of children in custody. 2020, that settlement agreement in McIntyre was reached, and it was approved by a court, federal district court in January 2021. And then we move ahead to the legislative session in 2021. The legislature establishes the Joint Committee on Child Welfare System Oversight through HB 2158. Also that year, that fall, Governor Kelly established the Kansas Division of the Division, oh, I have a typo there, of the Child Advocate by Executive Order 21-28. And then finally, last session in 2024, the Office of Child Advocate was codified in statute through SB 115. So that's what I have for those major events. And I don't know if you want to take questions on those right now.
Are there any questions on their history? Representative Owsley?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Natalie. You said in 1996, when the state was undergoing privatization, that they did it in 3 phases. Can you repeat that?
Yes. October 1996, adoption services were privatized. And then foster care case management was February 1997. And then family preservation services were in July of 1997, I believe.
Madam Chair. There's no mention in here of any action taken in 1960 when the feds passed the Fleming Rule. And I was curious if Kansas just didn't change a thing, or, because I know that dramatically altered child welfare in the nation.
Sir, the what?
The Fleming Rule.
I'm not.
It allowed unsuitable, and it offered states to either support or remove children. And I thought I'd see something in this timeline on that, and the absence is curious.
I don't believe we have previously provided information on that in any of our publications, but I'll look into it and get back to you.
Representative Humphreys?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a quick question about the settlement agreement in McIntyre versus Howard. Can you, in the previous one, you said there were 153 requirements in a certain time. And just to remind me, like the number of requirements or when everything had to be done, or just any, I can look back on what the settlement was, but I wondered if there was just kind of a quick overview about that.
Unfortunately, I do not have information on that particular settlement at my fingertips, but yeah, I know it's divided in periods, that there are certain things that are required for, yeah.
I just was curious how it compared to that other one. So, okay, thank you, Natalie.
Yep.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Any other questions from the committee? Okay, you can continue.
Okay, so now I'm going to turn to the Joint Committee on Child Welfare System Oversight's annual report to the 2025 Legislature that was just approved last Friday, so it's hot off the press. So as a bit of background for those of you who may not be familiar with this joint committee, it was first established in 2021 by HB 2158, which I mentioned earlier, that also, and is comprised of 7 representatives and 6 senators, meets quarterly throughout the year, so those joint statutory committees meet, in the interim and also through session. Statutorily, the committee is charged to review certain items, including data on child maltreatment, duties that are required of certain state agencies as they pertain to child welfare, the programs, services, and benefits offered by state agencies and their contractors, reports from child welfare stakeholders, complaints against agencies and contractors, data and trends on foster home licenses, and then the committee may also review any other topic it deems appropriate. So it's a pretty broad charge. This year, the committee met in March, June, September, and November. Just as in general, each meeting provides members of the public, providers of child welfare services, organizations with concerns, private citizens, to present testimony to the Joint Committee. And historically, we've had a large range of people, including former and current foster parents, adoptive parents, biological family members of children in the system, and former foster youth. Also at each meeting, we hear from DCF. They update on foster care, numbers and trends, new program rollouts that they have that they're want to tell us about, legislative proposals and agendas. We also hear from the Office of, or the Child Advocate, and she reports on the complaints received in that particular quarter at each of those meetings. Case management providers and family preservation service contractors also provide updates at each of those meetings, and they provide data on the number of youth in care, the length of stay, the number of youth missing from care, staff turnover, and other items. And then this last year we had a presentation from Casey Family Programs, I think at every meeting, and they present on a range of topics. This year presentations included comparison of foster care rates nationally with those of Kansas, improving the court's role in the child welfare system, interventions that may be taken to prevent entry into care, and how states can narrow the path to entry to the child welfare system. So at this point, I'm just going to read you basically the conclusions and recommendations of this joint committee. So let's see, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I think about 18 recommendations were made this year. The first one was that case management providers should report at each committee meeting the number of positions in their organizations filled at that time by unlicensed individuals. School districts, second, as school districts, case management providers, and DCF should take a multi-pronged approach in notifying foster youth of any financial or educational benefits that may be available to them after reaching the age of 18 or graduating. Literacy assessments should be required for every child adjudicated to be in need of care. Bench cards used by judges and attorneys practicing in child in need of care cases should include questions verifying that the guardian ad litem assigned in the case has met with the child. When a foster youth has a change in placement that requires enrollment in a new school, case management providers need to ensure such enrollment is timely. Law enforcement officers should provide written information to parents regarding what is to be expected in the 72 hours following a police protective custody removal. Along those lines, legislation providing additional resources for law enforcement with respect to those police protective custody removals should be supported. Another recommendation is that the committee should develop a list of questions standardizing the minimum quarterly reporting requirements for family preservation and case management provider grantees. Legislative staff should inform the family of A.J. Iverson of the process for filing a claim against the state with the Joint Committee on Special Claims against the state. The House Committee on Child Welfare and Foster Care, so this committee or successor committee, should hold informational hearings on the following topics. 1, legislative reforms pertaining to the reporting of suspected child abuse and neglect. 2, consideration of legislation granting Miranda rights for parents involved with the child welfare system. And 3, whether out-of-state child custody orders are being honored by Kansas courts. Kinship care placements should be made as early as possible, and legislation considering a child's attachment to kinship caregivers when granting adoption should be supported. DCF should shorten the timelines by which foster youth must receive mental health treatment, and the committee should consider possible enforcement mechanisms to accomplish that goal. DCF should ask contractors to record details pertaining to youth who miss mental health treatment appointments at behavioral health clinics, including the reason for the missed appointment and how frequently appointments are being missed, and basically compile that data to report to the committee. Kansas universities with social welfare programs should present information to the committee regarding their individual efforts to encourage students to pursue careers in child welfare. The State Child Death Review Board should provide education to the general public on safe firearm storage. The House Committee on this committee should prioritize the consideration of legislation amending the definition of neglect in the Sync Code. And this committee should consider DCF's legislative priorities as presented to the Joint Committee at its November 2024 meeting. So that was a lot of information, but that is, I think, where I'm going to stop and take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Natalie. And we've already accomplished 2 of those with bills that were introduced or requested in this committee with the Miranda rights and the one that DCF introduced or requested today with a definition of neglect. So are there any questions? It's kind of a big overview. I get it. These are all day long meetings, so there's a lot that we accomplish or try to accomplish in those. And sometimes the last 2 were day-and-a-half meetings. Last one, yeah, it was a 2-day meeting, so there's a lot done. Okay, no questions. Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am. I'm so sorry.
I didn't know if you had data.
If you could use your microphone.
I'm
yeah.
sorry.
No, you're
I didn't
good.
know if you had data to show monies that have been paid out in this system through the years that would show if there was neglect or something, or to make sure that people were doing what they were supposed to do in terms of how the money was spent. Did it go that far, or just wondering?
I don't know. That would probably be more the social services budget area.
Yeah, in terms of the amount of how much money is being spent on sort of the contracts for foster care case management providers?
2 lawsuits.
Oh,
What the amount that was spent on those to kind
Gotcha.
of look at how the money's being spent and whether people are doing what they're supposed to do. You know, you're paying money, are we getting our bang for our buck? Because you're talking about changing things. I don't know if that would be a look at the finances as well to see if everything is going accordingly.
yeah, I can look into that for you and see if we can find some information on that.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you, Natalie. Okay, next I'd like to welcome back to committee Secretary Howard, and she's going to give us kind of an overview of where we are today.
Thank you again, Madam Chair. Laura Howard, Secretary, DCF. And I'm actually going to kick off this overview, and then I'm going to hand over a chunk of it to my Deputy Secretary, Tanya Keys. So again, thanks for the chance to just kind of come and talk with you about kind of the current status of foster care and a little bit of explanation about just kind of how the system works, who the parties and players are. I just started out this presentation with just the overall mission statement of the broader DCF agency, which is to protect children, strengthen families, and promote adult self-sufficiency. I think all 3 pieces of that mission statement fit into the context of our work around child welfare and some values there as well. I gave you a little bit of an administrative chart that shows our Deputy Secretary, Tanya Keys, who's with me here today. And she really directs all of the directors who are over our DCF program areas, as well as our regional directors.
Can I get you to pause just for?
Yes.
Does everybody know where we're at? It's the slideshow is on the S drive. Just wanted to remind everybody. Okay. And then Tech, do you know how to put that up on the screen? Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Slide 5 is just kind of a bubble chart that shows the major programs for DCF. And I really just included this because I just wanted to give a little context for where kind of our prevention and protection services, our child welfare services fit within the larger context of our agency. You know, we have 4 overall program areas. Prevention and protection is the largest, but DCF is also an agency that does, you know, basic benefit programs for individuals through our economic supports. I'm an agency that's responsible for child support services and for vocational rehabilitation services. But prevention and protective services is by far the largest. It's about half of our agency's budget. It's about 2/3 of the state funds that come to DCF flow in this area. So within prevention and protection services, we kind of have 4 main areas on slide 6. And and we'll touch on some of those today. We have a director of prevention and a number of prevention services that I'll talk about in just a minute. We have a director of permanency and licensing, who is Rebecca Gerhart. That includes really the foster care functions of the agency. We also have director of practice model and performance improvement. We have a lot of work that's really around quality assurance and outcomes and data, and what practice model are people using? Are people well trained in that? And then monitoring the various federal performance indicators, the indicators under McIntyre and the like. So a lot of performance improvement work within our agency. And then we brought on a few years ago a specialized unit related to mental health and Medicaid to put more focus on that within DCF. But so overall, that when we look at this entire part of our agency, Prevention and Protection Services helps families by first providing those protection services. Those are those front-end responses to reports of abuse and neglect. And DCF is responsible for both child protective services and adult protective services. We don't talk very much about the adult side, but reports are made to the Protection Report Center related to children and vulnerable adults. And this is a function that within the organization is staffed and managed through DCF staff. And I say that because when we talk about, kind of an privatization of the child welfare system, the front end in terms of child abuse investigations, the review of those reports, the investigation of those reports, that's not a privatized function. That's work that's done by DCF staff in our field offices across the state and at our protection report centers. We also have an array of services related to supports to families, various family support services, some of the prevention services that I'll touch more on in just a minute, as well as for youth who need to come into custody, the foster care services, adoption services, as well as targeted supports to older youth in our custody in terms of independent living services, particularly connected to those youth who may age out of our care. We also have regulatory responsibility over this system in terms of licensing of family foster homes and group and residential care. So again, a broad scope. Most of today's presentation will be about foster care, but I wanted to kind of put it in the context of the broader array of the work that we do from the time, for example, that we get a report of abuse or neglect. I wanted to speak just a minute about the prevention pieces of the agency. This is a part of our function and our work that has expanded significantly in the last few years. In the history that you heard earlier, you heard a bit about family preservation and kind of the privatization of family preservation in 1997. We had had some family preservation before that, and there was some touch of it statewide as soon as the early 90s. But with the privatization in 1997, we began to have family preservation services all across the state in every county. That was really our primary prevention possibility. If a family came to our attention through a report of abuse or neglect, that was the primary service that we could offer in the context when we felt that those services might help a child stay safely at home. That all changed in 2019 when the federal government passed the Federal Family First Act. And that was a federal piece of legislation that began to allow some portion of federal foster care dollars to be used for front-end services, really to try to support children and families in their community and avert the need for youth to come into care. That federal act passed in 2018, this legislature acted very quickly, and we jumped very quickly, and I appreciate it very much. I think it was my first year back at the agency, and you did what needed to happen statutorily and appropriated some of the state match to those federal dollars for us to really kind of jump full speed ahead into a broader array of prevention services. And under that act, the really neat thing about that act is the way it was constructed federally. Not only could we draw some federal matching dollars for certain services, but they really constructed it so that so the states were really investing in evidence-based services, and they needed to fall into, specific categories: mental health, substance use, kind of parent skill building, and then kind of a legal support to families called kinship navigation. It's also, I think, it's also been so valuable in the sense that we can learn a lot about effectiveness. States have to have evaluations of the program. We have a very robust evaluation through some partners at the University of Kansas. So this is a program that we administer through grants and contracts across the state with a lot of different providers, some home visiting providers, some specialized mental health providers. Every single one of those is evaluated for their outcomes. So we tend to talk to you about the aggregate outcomes, but we know the outcomes of every single one of those programs. And so again, very, 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 very important from that perspective, because you kind of need to know what works to know what to invest in and what not to invest in, as Representative Page was talking about earlier. So also on the prevention side, well, actually, I'll stick on Family First for just a minute. We've been very pleased with those outcomes. We know that 90% of children and youth who've been referred to Family First have remained safely in their home without the need for foster care 12 months after the time of their referral. So we're really right at our goal of 90%, and only 5% have been placed in foster care during an open Family First case. So when we think that more than 6,400 families have been referred for these services that were not available before 2019, that's a significant impact, as you see when we start talking about like our foster care caseload and the reductions we've seen in foster care, because we've been able to safely support children and families at home through Family First. There's been some other programs as well that I've been so grateful to receive support for. The Family Crisis Response, kind of the Children's Crisis Helpline and Crisis Response System that kicked off in 2021. And then as well, more recently, some of the work around parent legal representation and Title IV funding for legal prevention. So again, a lot of work around the prevention side in terms of how might we support families in the community. So with that, Madam Chair, I'm going to hand off the foster care piece to Deputy Secretary Keys, but we'll both be here for any questions you might have.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome to committee.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Tanya Keys in the role of Deputy Secretary. Thanks for the opportunity to get into a little bit more details about foster care. So I'm starting on slide or page 8 for you all. Wanted to talk a little bit, just get grounded in the beginning processes of foster care. So only law enforcement or a court has the authority to remove a child into the custody of the secretary in foster care. DCF does not remove children or decide to initiate the state custody without a court order, just to get that grounded. When we're alongside a family, might be an assessment or an investigation of a worry that's been presented to our agency. We're alongside that family. We have tools. We complete assessments and or an investigation. Might include law enforcement, might not. But we're in a process with the family. That process includes a family meeting called a team decision-making meeting. So if we have worries that safeties of the child might need everyone to come together to think of the safest decision for the child. Sometimes that could mean prevention services that you heard discussed by the secretary and those options. Sometimes the safest decision is foster care. And that leads us into approaching a court with an application for a petition for the child to enter foster care, or it might involve law enforcement at that time, but eventually that becomes to court involvement. A little bit about those beginning pieces of the court involvement. When that is initiated, a temporary order of custody, that needs to happen within 72 hours, so that's the timeline. Subsequent to that, an adjudication hearing needs to happen within 60 days, and then the court process proceeds, and I'll talk a little bit about permanency here in a bit, and the state's burden of proof with regard to their evidence in the Child in Need of Care Code is clear and convincing. So that gives you a little bit of those beginning pieces. And the next slide, I talked a little bit about those beginning pieces of entry into care. The next slide shows since 2006, the number of children entering care over time. Recently, last year, 2024, with the 2,578 children who needed to enter foster care. That's the lowest that we know of, at least since 2006. So we're pleased, and certainly, I know the Secretary just reviewed with you the prevention efforts. So thank you for that. A lot of efforts at prevention and permanency, around those entries. So that gives you a sense of the scale over time for the need to enter foster care. The next slide is slide 10. Right now, and it tells over time, at a point in time, the number of children in foster care. So most recently, on 12/31/24, so New Year's Eve this year, there was a need of about 5,574, so a little bit over 5,500. The number of children in care and the need for foster care in Kansas has reduced over 25% since 2018. So you get to see a little bit of the trend there on slide 10. The next slide, 11, kind of gives a context to the reduced need for foster care. What the navy and the yellow shows is what's helped us reduce the need for foster care over time is the number of children exiting care is greater than those entering care. So when you have more leaving a program or a service than entering, then the overall need reduces. So it's been a combination of prevention and permanencies that have helped really impact the need for foster care in Kansas. And again, that's number 11. All right, we're going to get into some programmatic pieces about foster care. So we have 5 case management agencies in Kansas who are providing the actual services and supports alongside families or coordinating with families. Those are St. Francis Ministries, KVC Health Systems, TFI Family Services, Cornerstones of Care, and Ember Hope Connections. These case management agencies who are alongside a family, in general, they are, in their program and their contract requirements, doing some initial screenings. They're doing case plan development alongside court for permanency. They're doing placement stability support, parent skill building, and they are the entity that would coordinate with managed care organizations or other community providers to make sure that the supports and services that the child and the family would need so they can reach their permanency goal. The next slide 13 gives you a map and says where those 5 agencies are. St. Francis has 2 areas, and let's see, Ember Hope is new. They're in Sedgwick County. So, and that's on the map. It's green, area number 7 for Sedgwick County. So Ember Hope is new. I know some of you have seen this map before. So that's a change. Ember Hope in the green, area 7. I'm ready for slide 14 on this. Let's talk a little bit about case plans and placements, because those are the activities alongside families, youth, their network, placement providers, and others. So I mentioned earlier that an adjudication hearing needed to happen within 60 days. So after a child is adjudicated, a disposition hearing is held, and that really sets forth the case plan goal. So the case plan goal might be, and some of you have heard these terms, it might be reunification, adoption. It might be another planned living arrangement, or it also could be sole eventually, and that's a new option. So there are different permanency goals that could be set up, and all the activity should be supporting that goal. Placement decisions are the responsibility of the case management providers that you saw on the map. And courts hold permanency hearings right now. They're required through federal guidance, they're required to happen at least every 12 months. So there's a lot of activity that goes into play to make sure that there's information available to the court for those permanency hearings on progress toward the goal, whether if it's reunification or adoption, et cetera. That's the purpose of those hearings. Talk a little bit about placement on this. So the case management provider helps decide and facilitate the placement. Placements can be decided through team decision-making meetings. They're based on the needs of the child. We first wish to place with relatives, and you'll see some data later that shows that almost 50% of children who are in foster care are living with relative or kin. So they're living with someone that they had a connection with before they entered care. So then the other kinds of different types of placements might include, I mentioned relative and non-related kin. We have licensed family foster homes. Within family foster homes, there might be some specialized foster homes, such as therapeutic family foster homes. We also have a number of group care providers in Kansas who help us with that, such as emergency shelters, qualified residential treatment programs, and some other pieces. And they also might be in a psychiatric residential facility in terms of some of our partners for behavioral health service. So those are information about case plans and placements. All of that is really facilitated alongside the family by those case management providers. Page 15 goes into a little bit more detail regarding about 2,200 family foster homes we have. Within the family foster home license group of the about 2,200, we know that in December, 31 of them had made a commitment and are interested in being at a level of care of therapeutic family foster homes. So we have been able to be alongside 31 families who are interested in providing that more intensive level of care. The next slide, kind of touches on the state of the capacity and need for foster parents. As you see with the number of 2,200, we have a lot of gratitude for the number that we have who have opened their lives and hearts to this. But we also know we need more, and there are some children and young people and families who we would always need. We want them in a family-like setting. So if they're in group care or if they're in another type of placement, we want them to be in the most family-like setting. And for some, we might need more foster homes. For example, if they have high needs, if they're older than 12, we also know we need and enjoy and appreciate any specialized foster homes for children with high medical needs or infants with high medical needs. So we're always wanting to build the capacity for children with special needs. What we've really been learning, I think, maybe in the past year and a half is we want to make sure that relatives and licensed foster homes have the supports they need. And maybe those supports need to come to their home, to help with some things every once in a while. So we've been trying to build capacity for in-home supports, such as provisions of functional family therapy that can come into the home. Also, children's behavior interventionist. These are ideas and innovations where you can support a family, support the youth's or the child's placement stability to give them extra support. So we're trying to find and take advantage of anything that we hear about that's working other places that can really help family foster homes. On 17, a couple of highlights on the next slides about some populations that are important, and we have put additional resources, and we've really been working hard in communities to make sure the well-being is positive. So there are some children and youth who are trying to solve problems by making a decision to not be in their placement. They're absent from placement, they run from placement. We want to make sure that we're supporting them. We created a special response team, which is a statewide network to augment case managers and really work alongside these youth for prevention of future run episodes and recovery, trying to find them. So we created this approach and have increased it And I think we're pretty excited that, and as of yesterday, there were 44 young people in foster care who were absent from their placement. That's a reduction over a number of years. I mean, there were some years in 2019, 2020, where the numbers might have been higher. The average daily might have been 80, between 70 and 80. For the past number of months, we've been averaging less than 45 on a day, and we know that that is a lot of hard work of families and the young people and those alongside them to help them make decisions. The next slide on 18 talks about another piece that we've been working really hard. Yeah.
I'm just curious about that before I forget. So the number of placements is because the number of children have been reduced. Is the percentage still the same of like 80 compared to the number of kids at that time in 2019 versus 40 to what the number we have? Is that, how does that compare? Do you know?
Yeah,
Any comparison on that?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair, for the question. The percentage hasn't changed that much because it's such a low number. So, for example, it's always been 1% or less, whether it was 75 or now that it's 44. So there's a fraction of a percent that it is lower. But in terms of when you look at it as a math formula of the percentage of 5,500 children in care. So for example, a few years ago, it might have been 70 out of 7,000 children in care. So it's difficult. I mean, it has decreased, but it's probably 0.1%.
That's fine. I was just curious. Thank you.
Yeah. Next, there's a term we use called failure to place, meaning we're not meeting the needs of the youth to define the placement. It's also known in some conversations as historically maybe children in offices or children we couldn't find a placement for, so they needed to spend time in an office overnight while we found a placement. We call it failure to place, so that's how you'll hear that term. We've been working really hard to prevent any instances of failure to place. So over time, the current status is that this, we do have this fiscal year, so since July 1, we've had 62 youth who have experienced an instance where they needed to be in an office overnight. 62 youth across 209 instances. This is an improvement, and it's also an improvement in that we know that it's focused in one of our contractors. Ember Hope has been working really hard, so it is concentrated in one county, and we're pleased that Ember Hope is coming up with innovations and ideas and having community conversations about how to reduce and eliminate that altogether. So that's the current number this year. So far, 62 youth have experienced that. I'm going to skip the next couple of slides because I think they sort of go over or repetitive a little bit. We know Ember Hope, and they've presented previously on the work that they're doing to present that. The next slide I'll talk about is 21, foster care payments and budget. So for these case management agencies, the 5 that I talked about, the contract itself really includes a monthly payment to case providers, and it's based on an average cost. And so that monthly payment for the year remains the same based on their caseload count. And that's the structure of how the payments are made. To child placing agencies who sponsor family foster homes, those payments are made twice a month for children who might have been staying with them in that month. We have other various ways to pay for, if there's some exceptional tasks that happen, adoption home studies. We also have a little bit of a contract for required qualified residential treatment programs. They need extra assessments that are due so that a judge can review appropriateness of that QRTP admission. So there are just some other services there that we have contracts to pay for. The cost of psychiatric residential treatment facilities that I mentioned earlier, that's a Medicaid, so that's not paid out of the DCF budget. We're excited on 22. We're really excited about some fundamental changes, and I think you've been hearing a little bit about that. We want community and need community engagement so that we can prevent the need for foster care. We want to cultivate community base and engage others in some of the decision making, and parts of that are Ember Hope and how they've been able to problem solve and reduce the number of children that experience failure to place. The last piece that I just need to go through is a little bit of a data snapshot that attempts to capture some longitudinal information. So I've just got that to go. On 24, a little bit about, we talked about if the safest decision is foster care, that might have been because of a presenting situation. So we know that 2/3 of the time the children are entering foster care, it's for a reason of abuse or neglect. That's what the worry was. There's a third that is not specifically related to abuse neglect, and we call that a family in need of assessment. So that's the distinction there. 25 goes into a little bit deeper dive into, when, for those 2/3 that have a need for foster care related to abuse neglect, what's that presenting situation, the primary situation? This chart shows over time the prevalence of specific types of abuse or neglect. What I can tell you, sort of the takeaway from this slide, is what we know is that when they're entering for abuse or neglect, the child's worries, 20% is related to an allegation of physical abuse. Another 14% is related to lack of supervision, and 10% is physical neglect. So those are the top 3 reasons that children are entering foster care. Well, what's interesting is physical neglect and lack of supervision are both within the definition of neglect. So in Kansas, when the reason to enter foster care is related to abuse or neglect, the largest reason is neglect, to include physical neglect and lack of supervision. So those are the top 3. The next slides talks about the permanency goal for children. I mentioned earlier, it might be reunification or adoption. This shows over time a pretty steady piece that reunification is the goal for more than half of children in care, and that's been steady across years. Right now, 52% of children in care have a goal of reunification. 35% have their goal as adoption. Regarding the length of stay in foster care, which is the next slide, the lime green on this one shows over time the number of months to go to reunification has increased. So, for example, in 2015, it shows the average number of months for reunification was 9 months. For those who are ending care, it was 9 months. What we know this year is it's 12 months. So over time, very slowly, it increased from 9 months to 10 months, and now it's 12 months. That's specific to reunification. So another way to look at this chart is adoption. For children leaving care related to their permanency reason is adoption, their average number of months in care is 43. So that's their time in care. And that's what this chart shows. The next on 28 is placement settings. And the takeaway for this, it has the numbers that are in there, but the takeaway for this is 47%, so almost half of children in care are living in a family foster home that's licensed. 37% are with a relative. Those are the 2 top placements. Less than 9% of children are living in a group care type placement. In terms of more snapshots, wanted to just give you a little bit of some federal outcomes. We do have, the Secretary mentioned, we have quality assurance and processes. We have 15 outcomes. We have a lot of data management reports. We're currently in a performance improvement plan so that we can meet and have accountability and document all our efforts associated with getting to timely permanency and placement stability. And our contracts do have performance incentive and penalties associated with the contract outcome requirements. So for example, on 31, we can see children are safe in foster care. This is a federal measure, and lower is better on this one. So the rate The victimization rate per 100,000 days in care, and again, this is a federal measure with a federal operational definition. Most recently, that rate has been 3.27, which is lower than, so that's good, lower than the 8.5. On 32, timeliness in the first 12 months of care, we are not meeting that, and Kansas hasn't met this requirement for a while. So we are continuing to work on having a shorter length of time in care for all children in care. This measure happens to look at the ones who've been in care 12 months or less. Placement stability rate, we want to be at a rate that's 4.48 or below. And that's roughly about, 1.5 or 1.7 placements in the first year of care. That's how that comes out to, even though we can't have a half of a move. So we want fewer than 2 moves in the first year of care. And we're not there. We're at 7.3. So we're also in a performance improvement plan to improve that. On 34, we're excited about our commitment to have children placed with relatives and kin. And so statewide, we're at 48%. The children are placed with someone they had a connection with before they entered foster care, and that's their relative or kin. So we're excited about that. I think you heard this morning about our legislative agenda. We just had those 3 bills introduced. So the definition of neglect, changing permanency to 9 months, and reducing the number of days in secure care. And you've also been introduced to Andrea. If you have any questions or need to contact anyone, thank you. Happy to answer any questions or defer to the secretary.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary. Are there questions?
Yes.
Okay, Representative Page?
Okay. I taught school.
On your mic?
Sorry, I taught school for 30 years, and I ran into quite a few older grandparents who were taking on, has that improved? What's the average age of family members who are foster care?
Thank you, Madam Chair and Representative. I don't know that answer. I can see if we would be able to get the age of caregivers.
Kept data on that to see.
Yeah, I don't, off the top of my head, I don't know if we have data, but we can certainly look to see.
And a lot of them needed help.
Yeah, we definitely, yeah.
I didn't know if you offered something for them because of their age, and they need dealing with stress and financial matters. They kept saying they didn't have enough money to do a lot of the things that they wanted to do.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that. We do offer support if they're interested. We support them. They do. Our case management agencies have. They might have different names, but they have positions that support, like as a kinship supporter, a kinship navigator, to help relatives who want to provide care for children who are in foster care. We recently, not really recently, sorry, that's not the right descriptor, a couple years ago, we're able to change the reimbursement rate for relatives to make it at 70% of a licensed family foster home. We're the 3rd state in the country to be approved for abridged licensing standards for relatives to create some ease and exceptions or waiver processes so that if they want to become licensed, there's a bit of an easier path to do that. And as I mentioned, the supports that we have, for example, functional family therapy or a behavior interventionist or just someone to be in the home a little bit more to help them, relatives need to know those are available and they would be provided at the same level that they would be a licensed family foster home.
Thank you, ma'am.
Representative Neighbor, sorry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I know the kinship thing was very big when it first hit. And, but I've heard from constituents who have had some concerns when family members were sent to be with other family members that also had problems. So they look for the kinship, but how much are those people vetted for problems, alcoholism, addiction, or the same feeling about punishment and things like that? Because I know we've lost some kids because of that. And so what do we have in place so that that doesn't happen?
Thank you, Chair and Representative, for the question. In my testimony, I talked a little bit about when a child enters care, the family is gathered, it's their meeting, and they bring relatives. And we want to make sure that we're doing family finding and assessing all relatives. So we do team decision-making family meetings as a way for the family to get together, and in the sense that if there are a lot of resources to be able to be a relative caregiver, the family can also help choose. So there's a team decision-making process where the family is included in that. Now, once a family member is identified, or maybe there's more than one that wish to be assessed, there are background checks, there are assessments, there's a walkthrough in the home. We want to make sure those decisions are as safe as possible, and we need to get information from family members and networks, or if they are working alongside a provider or a helper in the community, they can also be involved. But there is a home study and a walkthrough process and a background check for relatives. If they wish to become licensed, there's a bit more involved, but they don't have to become licensed. But there are provisions and processes that the case management agencies do before a child is placed there.
May I? How many visits are then placed to that kinship home to follow through with how the placement is going and to make sure that everything is functioning as it should?
Thank you for the question. There's a minimum of one visit a month. Typically, if the child is just entering care, if they're in their first 6 months of entering care, or it's a new placement, those are more frequently than once a month, but the minimum is once a month for relatives, and that would be, needs to be a face-to-face with the child, and half of the visits with child over time need to be in their placement setting. You know, we can go to school sometimes and talk to them, but the intent is to really see them in their home environment and see how things are going on.
One more quick question. We've also heard of situations where the children are placed in the home, the guardian ad litem or the caseworker don't see eye to eye on the placement sometimes. And who do you talk to make that assessment if there is a disagreement on how that placement should occur?
There are some pieces in policy and practice around, I've mentioned this family team meeting of team decision making. Those are convened as often as they can be, and we would hope that any professionals alongside the family would be including others in a conversation so that it could be worked out. I mean, ultimately, there are some other processes in place if it can't be resolved, if there are worries that a move happened that someone wishes to object to. You know, there's a pathway for parties to object to a placement or let the court know that they're worried of the objection of a notice of move. There are also provisions where if we know we're going to move a child, we need to be giving notice of a move. So there are formal provisions for it. I think what we hope is that things can be worked out in family meetings so we know the level of care that's needed for the child is really going to meet their needs. But I don't know if that answers your question or is helpful, but hopefully the guardian ad litem and case manager in their conversations with the young person or the child or the family could work it out once they have all the facts they need.
Thank you very much.
Representative Humphreys.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I actually have questions kind of on two different topics, but the first one is slide 34, you know, which is talking about the placement, the percent with relatives or non-related kin, which we're going up and up, so that's good, and the performance standard is 50%. I'm thinking this is not really available, but when I see this chart, I'm so curious. So that's 48.3% of children that are in care right now are either with relatives or non-related kin. So my question is, where did they start out? So, how are we doing with getting children into homes with kin or relatives right away? And so I don't know if you can parse out those numbers like that 48%. Well, 20% of them started out with a foster family, and then they eventually removed a year later, 2 years later, whatever. It's probably impossible to parse all that out. But what do you think about that?
Madam Chair, Representative, thank you for the question. We do have as a separate measures, our regional directors and our region staff, they share the same outcome, that 50% of initial placements are with relatives. So we do have that data. There are a couple of our regions, Kansas City and I believe Southeast, who we know that the initial placement, 50% or more of children entering care, their first placement is with a relative. So we do have that point in time data as it pertains to an initial placement. What you have on this slide before you is the point in time on the last day of the month for children in care. So it's just really a point in time snapshot, and we augment that with data that shows for the initial placement what was the percentage with relative.
That's super interesting, and that's exactly what I was asking. So yeah, thank you for that. And so, but along those lines, I think that DCF, there's an RFP about family finding. Are we using, or maybe it's already have something in place about that already, or where are we at as far as that family finding so that we can have that initial placement with family?
Thank you, Madam Chair and Representative, for the question. I think what you might be referring to is an information system or a technology that could be used by DCF and all of our providers, prevention and foster care, around family finding in a way that could store information about families so that it's there and the work isn't replicated if you're trying to locate a family member. So yes, we are in the process of working with Department of Administration and others to be able to get that RFP ready.
No timeline on that or anything?
No timeline today. It's been initiated, and we're working through the procurement process.
Okay. Thank you. May I just have one other line of questioning? So it has to do with Family First, which, the family preservation, so exciting. And I was actually kind of in on the front end of that when I think NCSL had a Family First right at the beginning event for states. Different people from states went to that. And so my question has to do with referrals. Like, I think at that time, the referrals all had to go through the state agency. And so I'm curious, if now, since we're maybe 4 or 5 years after that, we've been doing Family First, and I do give kudos to all of you at DCF because you jumped right on that so quickly. But what about the community referrals, so that, I don't know, schools or whatever, they can refer people to family preservation? It doesn't have to go through the state, per se. How does that?
Thank you, Madam Chair and Representative. Yes, thanks for asking about community referrals. So what you're referring to is part of the process for a prevention service, whether it's family preservation services or a Family First, an array of those. One of the requirements so that we can draw down as much federal financing as we wish is that the child needs to be considered or declared a candidate for foster care. And that's sort of a special designation. So typically the state agency, our staff are creating this definition of they're a candidate for foster care, they're at risk for foster care, so they're eligible for the service, and we make a referral. There was a request, and we did a time-limited project with DECA in family preservation to see if community referrals, meaning, so for example, could a hospital, for an infant or a preschooler, or, could they make a referral without needing to contact our Protection Report Center. So we tried that, and DECA was great and worked with a couple of hospitals in the Kansas City metro for that. And then it still ultimately has to come to DCF because we do have to record the family and that we're alongside the family because we have to report that in order to draw down the federal dollars. We learned a lot when we were trying it. We discontinued it because for whatever reason, and maybe that's adaptive change, we couldn't get the community to make the referrals. So it's out there. We tried it. It continues to pop up as, are there other ways for us to explore a community referral process? We're open to those conversations. So far, the number of referrals we thought we would get using a percentage, like for example, 10% of Kansas City's referrals could come from the community. So we set up some systems for it and they weren't utilized. So we didn't want other families to miss out. So it was sort of discontinued, but there are still active conversations among stakeholders and providers about, what could that look like?
Yeah, it's helpful. I didn't realize that you had that history. So just my last comment about that is, because it does seem like there's families that, could benefit from family preservation or, different helps ahead of time, but they're reluctant to ask, even like word of mouth from, they see something going on with their neighbors or whatever, but they're reluctant to ask because they think the state's going to have to get involved. And there's families, that are just hesitant about doing anything, thinking that DCF's going to get involved. So I hope we do kind of try to continue to figure out, because it seems like, that there's a lot of great help going on with family preservation and all of the help. So hope we can do that. Yeah.
Thank you.
And just to follow up on what Representative Humphreys, does the federal funding, does that have to go through Department of Children and Families, or is it just a state agency?
The Department for Children and Families is the entity that has the state plan for Title 4B and Title 4E. So yes, I mean, there are some other opportunities around home visiting, et cetera, that have different federal funding sources. And there's a lot of home visiting and parent skill building that's available in communities without Department for Children and Families. For example, Parents as Teachers or Healthy Families. A lot of local health departments have their own home visiting programs. So that happens out there everywhere. The programs that the Department for Children and Families has is really tied to definitions around, there's a child or a family who is experiencing a child at risk for foster care. So there's different categorical differences, but many of the home visiting programs they're universally acceptable or accessible in communities that have those programs, whether it's through their school district or their local health department or otherwise.
Thank you. Other questions, committee? Representative Esau?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think I have three. Two of them are related. One is, okay, I'll start with the simple one. I'm hearing that we have a lot of caseworkers who are not licensed, maybe licensed social workers, may be the word I'm looking for, and perhaps are overwhelmed or don't have the support systems that they need to be able to make some good decisions, so we have a lot of turnover. And related to that is, are they documenting what they are seeing within a home so that the next caseworker that's working on that one has the full picture of what's going on? Is there a requirement that they are licensed, and what kind of support are they getting, and what kind of documentation are we actually having as, because people change, but that child in need of care is the same child, so we need good documentation there. And I just wondered if we've made improvements on that.
Sure. Madam Chair, and thank you, Representative. I'll take the latter first. So regarding documentation, with regard to case management and notes or logs that might happen, there are a lot of formats and, for example, information sharing that we would want to make sure the family would have that would go into a court report. So there are some uniform pieces regarding the placement, the child's health, mental health, dental health, activities, how are they doing, and school. So there are core features of documentation that are required in our sort of standards about when we want to be able to know how a child's doing what do we need to make sure that we're looking for and talking with their caregivers. So there are those core components regardless. The case management piece is there's a case manager, and then sometimes there's also an additional or augmented, for example, maybe a family support worker or a kinship care worker that I mentioned. So a case management agency at a minimum has a case manager, but also may have a team or some supports around that case manager. We require our case management agencies also to be child placing agencies. The regulations for child placing agencies do require a license. There are opportunities for them to request exceptions. Perhaps they have a social work degree, but they don't have their license yet. So we do have a way to manage exceptions. The qualifications for those who might be, for example, a kinship care worker or a family support worker do not require a license. They may require a 4-year degree. Some positions or supportive helpers alongside a family don't require a 4-year degree. So there is an array of supports put around a child and their family based on their case plan and what their needs are. And so those different positions might have different qualifications. Regardless of their qualifications or their role or their title, we want to make sure they feel supported in their work they're doing. We want to make sure that there's employee engagement and that they're dedicated and feel supported in their career choice, however they are in a role of helping a family. So we would want to make sure we have the right training, development, career opportunities. We want them to love the work as much as we do. So
I think I did manage to combine two into one. So this one would be, is there a set amount of time, or maybe not even a set amount of time, where we involve the foster care family in that family decision-making as far as moving children, or are they getting all of their needs met in the setting that they're in? Do the foster care parents have a voice in that process?
Thank you, Madam Chair and Representative. Yes, we would wish for the foster parent to have a voice, and I hope our policies and practice and the tools we have support that. To the extent their level that they wish to be involved, they have an opportunity to write a report to court. They should be invited and included, and feel supported to attend case planning. Other types of maybe, if they're alongside a young person who needs to temporarily have some acute care or something, or maybe they need to go into a medical hospital, they have an injury, they should be, that caregiver, family foster home or relative, that caregiver should be engaged in everything. They're with the child, the child's living with them, so they need to be involved and feel supported to be involved.
Other questions, committee? Representative Roser, go ahead. We'll come back for seconds.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I want to say thank you for the 38 slides of information. Really appreciate that. I have a few questions. My first question, mental health support for DCF employees. I know we're talking a lot about foster care and everything, but I wanted to know if you had anything in place regarding the well-being of our caseworkers and other support employees at DCF.
And thank you, Chair, and thank you, Representative, for the question. Yes, we do. We more recently in the past year created a wellness coordinator position with hopes that it might be for the whole agency, but we're starting out with our protection and prevention services for adult and child, emphasis on child. So that wellness coordinator, we've learned some things from some other states. So there's some formal pieces available, let me say, through human resources, employee assistance programs, and ability for them to pursue something on their own. But in terms of our organizational commitment to wellness, we created a wellness position. We have an ability and a contract with Cornerstones of Care to help us with some debriefings when an employee has experienced something traumatic, for example, maybe they were alongside a family in an assessment or an investigation of a fatality or a serious injury of a child, and that can be tough to work through. So we have an opportunity for either an individual employee or maybe their unit or them with their supervisor or others to be able to talk about what happened in a way that's separate from the agency, so it's facilitated outside of our agency. Again, we have a contract to help with those difficult conversations. And also with that contract, we ask them to bring in some ideas about how every day we can help build, whether or not you use the term resilience or having a way to be able to feel successful in work that can be really difficult. So we are committed to that and have dedicated some resources to making sure that our staff feel supported. They have opportunities to talk about worries that they might have, and we want to support a work-life balance.
My next question pertains to slide 33. Is kinship placement included in that number for the performance standard trying to be 4.48 with the placement stability? So I know we're at 7.3. So is that including or excluding kinship care?
This measure looks at the number of moves that a child would experience regardless of where they might be moving between. So it could include a move from a relative to a family foster home, a group boarding home to a relative. It would include any type of move. So yes, to answer your question, I apologize, yes.
Okay.
It could include a relative,
One
I'm
second.
sorry.
Hold that next, is that another question? Okay, on that slide, I have a question about that. So how do night-to-night placements factor in this placement stability? How does that calculate in there? Is that a move or is it not a placement?
Thank you for the question. The moves in this, because this is a federal measure, our definitions are through federal guidance. This looks at, was the location of the placement the same from Monday to Tuesday? So if their location changed, if it is a night to night, they were one night with one family foster home, one night with a relative. Maybe that didn't work out. They went to another foster home. Those are different residential addresses. So those two would be considered moves, and that's included in the overall calculation to get to 7.3. It counts moves.
Which is why our Kansas numbers are probably high because of the night-to-nights that we do. But am I thinking right?
Yes, thank you for the question. Yes, for youth who have night-to-night moves, yes, that is a contributing factor. Those concentrated number of youth that are moving a lot.
You go ahead, Representative Roser.
I was going to ask the same question.
Oh, sorry.
Love when that happens. Yes, so custody hearings. If a child is under kinship placement and they have a custody hearing with their biological parent, family, parent unit, are the kinship care providers, it's my understanding, they are not required to be notified of custody hearings. Is that correct?
Thank you for the question. I guess I would need to follow up to see if they are not required. So I don't know the answer. I'll just leave it at that. I believe that, yes, they are provided notice. And in addition, as a placement provider, they would be providing the report to the court, to the judge. So they would be engaged that way and should know of the hearing. But for a formal answer, I probably should say, I don't know. We will look at the Child Needed Care Code and get back to you.
Okay. I have one last question.
Last question.
Yes, sibling unification. So keeping siblings together in the system. If you have a child that's in two different regions with two different providers, since it's privatized, what is the protocol for DCF to reunite siblings that are either in different counties or even being serviced by different providers?
And thank you for the question. We have policies and procedures in place that if and when siblings are separated, that decision is revisited and documented frequently. Again, I'll mention the family meetings we have with regard to team decision making. So the family, we hope, has been engaged in making a decision. Some of those decisions might be difficult. Each placement decision should be made based on the needs of the child. We want siblings to be together. If they're not, we need to document why not. But sometimes you have a circumstance of maybe one aunt here, another uncle here. They're not living together. Are they still going to be able to have interactions? So some of that is really based on the needs of the child and what their permanency goal is. But if they're not together, then there are specific policies and procedures to have deliberate conversations with the family and to understand why those siblings aren't living together.
Any other first-time questions? Okay, Representative Page.
Real quick, when you said failure to place,
You could use your mic.
sorry, I keep forgetting about that. Okay, failure to place. I thought I heard you say 62 kids that were in that category?
Yes, thank you for this fiscal year. So since July 1 of this year.
Can you give us some examples of what type of kids fall into that category?
Some of the attributes we know from some reviews we've tried to do to understand how to improve and how to eliminate this. They are in terms of their own attributes. They tend to be youth who are older. They are youth we know who certainly have a voice, and sometimes their circumstance, and I think I'm repeating some stories of how the case management providers have been talking about this, is that, every once in a while you have a young person who's had a difficult day, and perhaps it's late in the evening, and they don't really want to go to a stranger's home. They choose, or they describe that they choose to just stay in the office. Let's figure it out tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. That's one example. Another might be a youth who is recovered or found by law enforcement late in the evening. They had been on a run episode, and there isn't time to be able to find a placement. It gets too late in the night, and we aren't able to find a relative first or someone in that young person's network. And so the decision is made to stay in an office. So we're trying to keep learning, and with each thing that we learn, we think, well, we can eliminate that problem by doing this. But there are a number of young people who just wish not to go. They just want to wait till the next morning.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
And I had a follow-up question along those lines, asking how many kids were actually refusing placement, because that's what you're talking about. Is it actually that we can't find a place for them, or that they're refusing it? Because we heard in the joint committee, I think it was from Ember Hope, that they were refusing placement because they didn't have Wi-Fi in the home, or they couldn't have their phones, or other stories that I heard. So if you could elaborate some on that.
Yes, thank you. I mean, you're right, those are examples. We really want to learn from this, and from the beginning, we've taken this very seriously. When that occurs, that's sent directly to the secretary as a type of critical incident that is notified to the secretary each time it happens. There's a team decision-making meeting that happens, and we follow up, and the form that they submit to tell us about this happened, they try to include details about the nuances of what contributed on that calendar day to what led to that failure to place. And so we review those. We're trying to learn from them. As we learn about trends, we're trying to troubleshoot to be able to address that worry or that circumstance so that it didn't happen again for that young person, or maybe some other young people who might have had the same experience.
Okay, thank you very much. If there's no other questions. Go ahead, Representative Page.
What about the diversity of your?
Is your mic on?
Yeah, I just turned
Good
it
job.
on. Okay. The diversity of your staff, because sometimes I've had cases where I couldn't relate to them, but I had to go and find someone who could relate to this kid. Because, we love to say that it doesn't matter what your race is. It shouldn't. But for some kids, they were so frightened that we had to go get somebody, find somebody who could help them. And then once we did that, they kind of relaxed and things got better. So I don't know if that's something.
Thank you for the question. I don't have data with me on workforce attributes and demographics. We can try to get that information. I agree. Youth engagement is important, and certainly youth engagement can increase, and we would hope would alleviate or provide remedy to some of this.
And just so I think some of the contractors or whoever, they've spoken in joint committee that is a priority for them as well. So thank you, Deputy Secretary Keys. And I'm going to ask our child advocate, I see her in the audience, if she'll just come up and just introduce yourselves to the committee real quick. And while you're doing that, I'm going to announce that committee minutes will be emailed to you early next week for us to approve. So if you want to come on up.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Carrie Lonard, and I'm currently the acting child advocate with the Office of the Child Advocate, and appreciate the opportunity to introduce myself today. And wasn't really ready to, if there's questions or if there's information you'd like to know. I've been in this role with the division for about 3 years, and am now up for appointment under the new independent office.
You don't have to speak on anything. We won't make you take questions today. We'll hear from you in a future committee, but I saw you there and I wanted to introduce you to the committee because there's so many that are new. So with that, if there's any, look for agenda revision probably on Friday. I'm hoping to get some of those bills that we heard through the floor, get some House bills and assigned to the committee so we can actually start working on those next week. Okay, with that, we're adjourned.